Hello and welcome to Literacy Matters. I'm your host, Cheryl Lundy Swift. I am so excited to be here with our next guest, Molly Ness. Molly Ness, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Sure. So excited to be here with a fellow Wahoo. So Molly Ness is a former classroom teacher, a reading researcher, and a teacher educator. She earned her doctorate in reading education at the University of Virginia, Wahoo Wah. She spent 16 years as an associate professor at Fordham University in New York City, and she is the author of 5 books. Molly has also served on the board of directors for the International Literacy Association and is a New York State chapter founder of the Reading League. She provided literacy leadership for state advisory boards, nationally recognized literacy nonprofits, and major educational publishers. A frequent speaker and presenter, her happy place is translating the science of reading to schools and teachers. As a tireless literacy advocate, Molly created the In Book Deserts podcast, which brings awareness to the 32 million American children who lack access to books. Welcome to the show, Molly.
Oh, I'm so excited to be able to talk with you.
So, when we think about students who lack access to books or who may not have access to read aloud, and why are read alouds so important? Why are they a need to have, not a nice to have?
Yeah, and I'm so grateful to talk about read alouds at a time when conversations about the science of reading just feel like they're at fever pitch level. And so many of those conversations are focused on word identification, phonics and decoding. But we know that it takes a lot more than just lifting words off the page to become a proficient lifelong reader. It takes language comprehension. It takes the ability to use expressive and receptive language to communicate, to access content. And so read alouds really are one of the best ways to do that. As we read aloud to kids of all ages across all different content areas, we build their language comprehension. We build their ability to use language. And we have some pretty compelling data that shows that kids' listening comprehension outpaces their reading comprehension until about age 13 or 14, so about 7th or 8th grade. So this to me is this reminder that when we read aloud to kids, we need to be reading aloud from sophisticated text that is typically higher than their grade level because it gives them access to background knowledge and vocabulary and text structures and language usage that they would not otherwise be able to access on their own.
You know, when you said all students, right, all ages, but when we think about read alouds, oftentimes people think about little kids. So can you tell me why we should be reading to the big kids, if you will?
Sure. Well, one of the stats that I always pull up is a figure called the decline at 9, and it was appeared in some of the research by Scholastic, who does a really lovely biannual report about kids and families and reading practices both in school and out of school. And they found that right around age 9, there's a significant decline in parent read alouds as well as teacher read alouds. So we stop reading to our kids. We assume that the read aloud is too babyish or that kids can read on their own. And what really I find so fascinating is that when kids were surveyed, kids, the vast majority of them said, I wish my parent kept reading to me. I wish my teacher kept reading to me. So it's this reminder that kids want those read alouds, even if they can read on their own, even if they're accessing chapter books or what have you. But we again know that the power of read alouds isn't just for the purview of our elementary childhood or early childhood classrooms. It's kids across all grade levels, all content areas. We actually have just such a rich body of research showing the benefits, academic, linguistic, socio-emotional, even actually physiological and psychological benefits to listening to read alouds. So we never age out of read alouds. There's some pretty compelling work that's now being done to read aloud to people who are struggling with age-related diseases like dementia and Alzheimer's, people who are struggling with addiction or or PTSD. Because when we read aloud, we can actually see that the body gets a flood of neurotransmitters or chemicals that are like the feel-good things, things like serotonin. And we can start to really understand the power of read alouds far past, this ideal picture that we have, which is the kindergarten teacher in a rocking chair with kids around her at her feet on the rug. Really, read alouds are for all ages, all content areas as well. We can do read alouds in a middle school science class just as well as we can do them in a fourth grade class with a chapter book.
That's so powerful. And this is like a shout out to my former superintendent, Anita Scott, who would read to us at our principal conferences. She would do a read aloud, a little bit of it in the morning, a little bit at lunch, and finish it at the end. And we were all in. And I want you to know we've learned so much, but it was so exciting. We were all looking forward to that. So thank you for that. And so you mentioned these brain and physiological changes. That's really, really incredible. So, you mentioned families as well. I'm wondering, when we think about these physiological changes, what might you say to parents about reading aloud?
Absolutely. We know that reading aloud from birth literally helps our children, our babies, our infants and toddlers build and activate the neural pathways that then serve as a foundation for the reading circuitry. We can look at MRI scans and see that when we read aloud to our preschoolers, we see all sorts of activation and activity in the areas of the brain that are really used for language comprehension and understanding. And those are, of course, the foundational parts of the brain that we want to continue to develop as kids become readers themselves. One of my favorite studies is actually with hospitalized children. So these were children who were in the hospital for long periods of time. So, not just a broken bone or what have you. And the research team gave kids one of two conditions. They either had kids do riddles and games and puzzles, or they read aloud to them. And they measured two different things in terms of biochemistry. They measured kids' oxytocin. Our oxytocin is it's like the warm, fuzzy sort of thing. It's like if you go hug somebody you love or you snuggle with your dog, you get that warm flood of emotions. That's oxytocin. They also measured another chemical, which is it's the fight or flight one. It's the sort of, if you're about to be chased by a bear, it kicks in and gives you that stress release. And this is the chemical of cortisol. So what they saw in these read alouds is that kids who were read to before and after, they saw significant changes in blood chemistry. The kids who were read to had higher levels of the warm, fuzzy, feel-good oxytocin, and then lower levels of cortisol. They also asked kids to complete pain scales. And if anybody who's been to the doctor's office knows those pain scales, it's a series of faces, from smiling all the way to grimacing. And the doctor says, what's your pain level today? They had kids complete these. And these children, the only thing that changed was they listened to a read aloud. Their self-reporting levels of pain, their pain decreased just from the read aloud. So I'm telling you that literally this study, and this is a 2021 study, I believe, literally showed biochemical changes and physiological and psychological changes, all just from a read aloud. And if this is happening in a really sort of anxiety producing environment like a hospital, think of
Sure.
what it can do for us in our homes and in our classrooms.
Wow, you think about reading, like we're pouring language into children, and we hope that they can pick up on this language, but we're really doing so much more. It's really addressing so many things when we think about that. Wow, that's really incredible. It makes
Yeah,
me think about. Go ahead.
we even see socio-emotional changes. There are research findings that show that when we read to kids, we improve their self-regulation, which is is their ability to sort of be aware and in control of their own reactions and emotions. We see conflict resolution. We see more empathy. And certainly our world, who couldn't, our world certainly could use more empathy today. So we see lots of problem solving abilities. And I'm not even really getting into some of the obvious literacy benefits, which are better vocabularies, better background knowledge, better writing, better identifying yourself as a reader, more independent reading. Those are sort of the findings that we've sort of long known and teachers sort of instinctually know, but I'm sort of going into some of the unexpected benefits of read alouds.
Sure. That's incredible. I think our listeners are going to come away with so much because, like you mentioned, we know those academic benefits, but to then couple it with all of these social, emotional, physical benefits, I think is amazing. When I think about read alouds, I think about their connection to oral language. Can you tell me what that connection is and why it's important?
Sure. Well, when I'm talking about a read aloud, I'm talking about an interactive read aloud. They're sort of synonymous. And when we talk about interactive, we're talking about a language given exchange, a serve and a volley or a ping pong of language. So you as a parent or teacher read something, the child maybe points to something and you mimic the child or you expand upon their language. So it's all facilitated around engagement around this text where oral language is really one of the most remarkable things that we see. And we know that oral language is the foundation of literacy. And so what we're doing with these read alouds is giving our kids a really strong foundation in literacy that then all of their school instruction is layers on top of and builds from.
Yeah. So how do you actually plan? You mentioned that read alouds and interactive read alouds are the same thing, right? How do you plan for them exactly?
Sure. And I think back to my days as a teacher. I was a middle school teacher who used the read aloud as a sort of calming time when my kids were coming back from recess and the playground and the lunchroom, and they were, crazy and all rambunctious. And so it was sort of like let's like relax our bodies and get back into focusing to learn. So I would do a read aloud. And my planning was pretty minimal. I would look at how many minutes I had, how many pages I would cover, how many chapters I would read, and that was kind of it. And what's interesting is that there's some pretty compelling research that looks at the language use of planned versus unplanned read alouds. And not surprisingly, when we don't plan our read alouds, we miss instructional opportunities. Language is more surface level. We often don't focus on the best or most biggest bang for our buck in terms of vocabulary. So when I think about planning read alouds, I think about much more than just how many pages, how many minutes. I first think about what background knowledge do my kids know to be successful in this text. Every text assumes the reader brings something to the page. And if you don't have that knowledge, it's potentially a comprehension breakdown. So I look through the text and I sort of evaluate what knowledge do my kids need to have before I even open up the book. And so that's where I can sort of pre-teach or front load or explain something. One of the examples I always use is the beloved picture book Knuffle Bunny by Mo Willems,
Yes.
which takes place in a laundromat. Well, if you don't know what a laundromat is because you have a washer and dryer in your own house or you've never been to one, your comprehension is already compromised right there. But
Yeah.
what could I do? I could tell my child, we're about to read a book that takes place in a setting called a laundromat. A laundromat is where you go to do your wash and dryer. Here's a Google image of a laundromat. So what I'm doing there is I'm really sort of trying to front load to minimize comprehension breakdowns. The other thing that I do is I intentionally select vocabulary that is really essential to the story. I sort of differentiate it into two buckets. Words I can just explain and then move on versus words I really want to lean into and really want to teach. And then I think about, well, after the read aloud, how am I going to maximize this book? It's literacy opportunities. Does it have opportunities for cross-curricular ideas? Are there ways to build my kids' humanistic side through socio-emotional support? So sort of a little bit different when I think back to when I was a kid. Our post-reading activity was, the classic take a shoebox and make a diorama, which didn't really help us connect to the text or
Right.
make meaning of the text or understand it. So I'm moving past some of those old things and more so thinking about authentic literacy, cross-curricular extensions, and socio-emotional support.
I think we'd be remiss. We've talked about like all of the, the social emotional, the kind of body chemistry changes that happen. Could you actually tell, like, really kind of review what some of those academic benefits are for read alouds? Like, how could we convince, for example, the social studies teacher and the science teacher that read alouds are the way to go?
Sure. So, well, particularly when I work with content area teachers who don't always see the read aloud as their purview, they see themselves as, domain specific specialists or what have you. There's actually pretty compelling research, particularly in math. Probably the one that we most often sort of think like, yeah, I'm not going to read to my kids in math. That when you read aloud to kids in math, books about mathematicians, books about math problems and stuff, kids' computational abilities increase, their problem solving abilities increase. And what we know is that knowledge building is such an essential part of comprehension. So when you read aloud to kids in a social studies classroom, you're giving them background knowledge that then serves as a springboard for all of their comprehension. The other thing that I think is so powerful is that we have so many picture books that take really sophisticated, complex ideas and present them in a user-friendly format. For example, I was just working with a seventh grade teacher who was studying the period in history of World War II. They were looking at Japanese internment camps, which is certainly not one of the most well-known periods that sort of happened. And she was able to find a picture book called Love in the Library, which is a relatively new picture book that takes place in a Japanese internment camp. And just by reading that picture book to seventh graders, they now had a basic understanding of that time, that period, the challenges of the people who are in those conditions. And then it helped them unlock the sort of density of their textbook that was written in a way that was much more factual and much more sort of difficult to sift through. So it was sort of an easier or a more student-friendly approach to giving them that background knowledge that they needed to understand that particular time frame.
I love it. Is there any number that you should read, like any number of times you should read a book for read alouds?
Yeah, so actually this is where I confess my parenting mistake. So when my daughter was I guess, early childhood, kindergarten-ish, she wanted to reread the same book time and time again. I won't mention the name of the book because I will surely offend somebody who's like, that's my favorite book ever. But listeners can reach out to me and I will disclose the title. And after, I had my parenting patience, I read it once, I read it twice. And then for the seventh or eighth time, I hid it in the back of the bookshelf and told her that it was a library book. And my kid was actually very savvy. She was like, no, that's not a library book. We own that book. I think I may have blamed the dog for ripping up the book because I didn't know that the research shows that rereadings are particularly powerful for our younger kids to build the language of our multilingual learners, and any child for whom language is an area for development. Typically, we see real powerful benefits from rereadings at like 3 or 4 versions. And I want to be really clear that that does not have to mean you read the entire picture book cover to cover 4 times, because there's so many great books out there. If you're reading each book 4 times, how do you even make a dent in the library of children's literature? But you can choose really powerful passages that you read. And each part with each rereading, you can invite kids to participate more because they're familiar with it. You can sort of start a sentence and have them finish it. You can have them interject more language, so you're transferring some of that language to them as opposed to just being sort of you delivering it. So do what I didn't do as a parent, allow those rereadings to continue.
That's awesome. You mentioned multilingual learners. Is there anything special that one should do for multilingual learners when you're thinking about read alouds?
Well, so the great news is the research around reading aloud to multilingual learners, there's nothing different. They benefit from from read alouds in the exact same way. In many cases, they just need more explicitness, more pauses to make oral connections, more immediate vocabulary instruction in the moment. So if you encounter an unfamiliar word, immediately addressing it as opposed to holding it for after, and more chances to sort of turn and talk to a neighbor, to use their language and the language that they're developing to really comprehend and build from. So all of the same and more, but again, really powerful for our multilingual learners.
That's awesome. I really appreciate all the research you are providing for us. If you could leave our listeners, that means families, teachers, school leaders, with one inspiring note about literacy, what would it be?
So I'm going to do one, but it's going to be for two different audiences. So for
Okay.
parents, I would say to make the read alouds work for their busy life. Meaning, we all have this notion that when we're reading aloud to our kids, it's the like bedtime routine, you're snuggled in at the end of the day, and that doesn't always work. I think about my schedule when my daughter still wanted to be around me. She's 14 years old now and not wanting to snuggle up in bed next to me. But I wasn't always at the place where I had the energy at the end of a busy work day to make my voice sound engaging, to do all the, excitement of a read aloud. So I had to find a time that worked for me, which was maybe in the bath. She was, in the bathtub, you sort of have a captive audience. So
Right.
I would read aloud there, or we would read aloud in carpool line when I was waiting to pick somebody up. You're sort of, again, sitting in a captive audience. So like, I think we have to push past the idea that the read aloud is only a bedtime opportunity. You still get the same benefits. And I think when we help parents realize those benefits happen at any point, you are mindful about parents' busy lives and the realities of their day to day. So for school leaders and teachers, my one big takeaway would be that the read aloud is a must do, a should do, a want to do, a get to do, a have to do. And by that, I mean, we sometimes look at the read aloud as a luxury or as if my kids behave, they'll earn the read aloud. Or on the flip side, if my kids didn't behave, there goes the read aloud. And really what we're doing is we are taking away language comprehension every time we don't make it an instructional priority. So we have to be mindful that as we develop kids' language and literacy skills, not everything is quantifiable, not everything can be measured and analyzed and scored and have a metric next to it. But the read aloud is not a luxury. It is really essential in helping kids develop the language and literacy skills that they need and deserve.
Wow, that's powerful. Molly, it has been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for all the work that you're doing to provide book access to those around the world and really for sharing all of your information about read alouds.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.